Shabbat shalom to everyone. Just to say, before we paused for the Shema, there was a young one who said, "Yay!" right as we went into it. It just felt so perfect, like that moment of just silence, but also the anticipation and the joy of being able to pray and to be in that sense of unity just for a moment. And there are many lines and words that often will move me as we make our way through the tefillah together. And I have spoken about this and thought about it a lot in the ways in which I notice how they shift and change over time. Some of them striking me at a particular moment in my life, only for me to pass by them months later or even a day later or weeks later. Others that linger, they wait for me. They become words that I anticipate saying, and I think many who have a practice can relate to this. The liturgy isn't static, and it meets us differently depending on who we are and what we're carrying at any moment in our lives. One of the lines that's been piercing my soul each time we reach it is at the very end of our Torah service. It's when we say, "We pray, we preserve our humanity." It's not an ancient prayer. Rolly and Felicia actually wrote it after the atrocities of October 7th and the unfolding of the war in Gaza. It's a really simple sentence. It's not a grand theology of any type. It's not a complicated metaphor. It's an open-hearted plea. We pray, we preserve our humanity. For some, I know that this prayer is hard to say. And for others, it's deeply moving that we say it and that we need to say it. And still there are others where the feelings are complicated, and I'm sure they've also shifted over the past few years as the world and our place in it has also changed and morphed over time. That diversity of response and the willingness to wrestle honestly and openly is one of the things that I love most about being a part of this spiritual community that we build together. We don't demand uniformity of our feelings. We make space for complexity, even and especially when it feels hard. And when I reflect on what moves me about these words, it's precisely, I think, the simplicity that's held within them. They sound so obvious. Of course we want to preserve our humanity. Of course that's something that we want to do. And it's hard. It's hard to live them. And what are we willing to live them for? At what cost? There's nothing new about this struggle, and I think it's often the Torah that I feel very drawn to, the simplicity of things, but also it feeling like that's the hardest task that we have in our spiritual lives. And I would argue that often the more simple and obvious something sounds, the more urgently we need to be reminded of it, which I think the Torah gives us a lot of that. Be kind. Don't oppress. Love your neighbor. They're not sophisticated or very large moral ideas. They're basic demands, and still they're among the hardest things to fulfill, especially in a world that feels saturated in fear and in rage and anger. And we know that this morning as I came into shul, I didn't even know. I found out from Rolly that war is unfolding in the Middle East once again, although we were on the brink of it and we were just waiting. We've watched in horror as Jewish settlers burn, murder, terrorize Palestinians in the West Bank. We've listened as our hostages return and share the worst of what we could have ever imagined. And across the world, we know not only in Iran war, but also the protests that people are doing for their rights despite the threat to their lives. And we know war continues to rage in Ukraine. And here in America and across the North American area, where we have even in Canada, there's gun violence and school shootings. We're seeing attacks on women, on the queer community, and on immigrants. We watch rights contested, language that's abused, and entire communities that are made into scapegoats. Violence is praised by our own government. it's disorienting, it's destabilizing, and it's terrifying. And in moments like this, I think something happens to our hearts. Fear makes our hearts become more narrow. And the trauma and the pain, they make us harder. The instinct for self-protection grows louder than the call that we have toward compassion or helping others, and we begin to divide the world into us versus them, deserving and undeserving, innocent and those who are not. And so we pray, not to look away from these horrors, not to deny the hate directed to us or the violence inflicted by others or committed in our name, but to remain human as we face it. Amid the fear it awakens within us, we pray that we preserve our humanity. And this Shabbat, the Shabbat right before Purim, is one which is known as Shabbat Zachor. We read a special maftir that brings us back to the story of Amalek, the enemy nation that attempted to annihilate the Israelites during our desert journey. According to the rabbis, it's a mitzvah, it's actually a commandment to hear the words of the maftir this morning. Zachor asher asa lecha Amalek. Remember what it is that Amalek did to you on your journey out of Egypt. And we're also commanded to remember the Torah's deeply disturbing call, because it continues. It's only a few lines, but it says, Timched zecher Amalek mitachat hashamayim. You shall blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. They're not easy words. I don't think that they're meant to be. The psukim, these verses that we read, have been abused and weaponized, interpreted by some as permission to murder and terrorize our Jewish enemies, even to this day. It's one of those texts that forces us to ask not only what the Torah says, but how is it heard and how do people live it? What was so terrible about Amalek and what they did that they should be blotted out? We have many enemies, but this is one in particular. Every year we have a mitzvah. We are commanded to say we blot them out. We remember what they did. The rabbis teach that Amalek attacked from behind as Bnei Yisrael was walking in the desert, targeting the most vulnerable members of the society, the women and the children, those who were exhausted and weak, those who needed extra help on their journey, rather than those trained to fight who were standing at the front of the group. Amalek pried on the stragglers who were in the back, and Amalek took advantage of those who were exhausted. They chose the ones who were the easiest target. The image is haunting when you think about it. A people newly freed from slavery, trudging through the wilderness, and an enemy who does not confront them head on, but slips from behind to strike them least able, those who are failing, those who are struggling to defend themselves. There's also a tradition as to why we read it now, because there's an idea that Haman is actually a descendant of Amalek. So there's the connection to Purim. And from that tradition grows an idea that we must destroy every kind of manifestation of Amalek in our world, any kind of evil enemy that comes, that we have to blot them out, as we heard and we will hear. We have to get rid of them. We have to hate them. That hate should meet hate. And this is how the mitzvah can and sometimes has played out in Jewish imagination, and tragically also in reality, and in our history, and in our actions. Some read this as a warning. Some read the maftir this morning as get them before they can get us. It's even linked to a teaching from a midrash that says, and I really don't know what to do with this, I'm not sure, it's complicated, and it says, anyone who is merciful to the cruel will eventually become cruel to the merciful. The connection that's made through this midrash to Purim and Haman and to our reading is that Saul, who spared one of Haman's ancestors, many, many, many generations before in the time of the prophets, Haman then arose from that ancestor to target the Jewish people in the story of Purim. So mercy, the argument goes, created the way or paved the path for that cruelty that we saw later on to others. It's, I think, a frightening teaching. It's also powerful, and again, I think it speaks directly to the trauma and the fear that happens when we're so afraid. And it says, if you let your guard down, if you soften, if you hesitate, you're going to pay for it later. And there's a part of the Megillah we don't often teach our children here in Kadima, which is our Hebrew school. I think many of us don't learn it in Hebrew school, and many of us confront it only once we're older. And that's the part where the line between being the victim and the perpetrator becomes foggy and blurry. The Purim story rightly celebrates Esther and Mordechai's defeat and the Jewish people's defeat of Haman and the people being saved from this destruction, a total destruction of our people. And it's worth celebrating. And the book of Esther also tells us that the Jews of Persia killed over 75,000 people. 75,000 people. What may have begun in fear, perhaps even self-defense, although I'm not sure if that was the case at that point, but it could have been, it didn't stay that way. The text described not only survival, but large-scale killing, where things started with terror and vulnerability, and they ended in overwhelming force and murder. This, too, is a part of our story. And if we're honest, this part is shameful to face. And here we often will dim the lights. Sometimes people will read it in a softer voice when you get to that part of the Megillah. Because it means that the Torah and the Megillah are not simply stories about what was done to us. They're also stories about what we are capable of doing. And they really refuse to let us just rest in a sense of our moral innocence. And so, as I've taught before, we don't read and remember Amalek to ignite or to make it so that our instinct for self-defense is what we need to go toward. I feel like particularly this morning when we feel so vulnerable, it's a good reminder for us to say, we want to go sometimes to that place immediately. But maybe we want to read it as a warning about what fear can turn us into. We read it to say who we can be, who we want to be. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, one of the biggest thinkers in the Orthodox world of the 20th century, offers a really beautiful and striking interpretation where he says, the point of this mitzvah to remember and to blot out Amalek is to remind us now that it is possible for any creature of flesh and blood to become as wicked as Amalek. That each of us, however great our spiritual accomplishments, must worry that we ourselves might be tricked into committing the most serious sins, even those that everyone considers to be the most despicable. All of us can have that. It's a Hasidic way of thinking too. A lot of the Hasidic thinkers also say there's an external Amalek, but each of us also has this evil that's a part of us that we can't deny, that this warning also is an inward call, not only external. In other words, remembering Amalek is not only about identifying our enemies, it's about confronting our own capacity for cruelty. It's about acknowledging that even evil is not only out there, but it's also in each of us. And it's really part of being human. It's a part of being human. And on this Shabbat, we recall the commandment to remember and blot out Amalek as a way of beginning the work of blotting out our own tendencies toward that kind of evil, toward the indifference, toward that want for revenge when we feel so hurt, scared, or angry. We remember not so that we will harden our hearts, but so that we will preserve our humanity. Purim is about wrestling with the violence and the threat that the Jewish people have endured, and that we undeniably continue to endure. Our history and present Jew hatred that we face give us no shortage of reason to feel afraid in our world. But Purim is also about wrestling with the violence we are capable of committing when we are really afraid. And Shabbat Zachor in particular calls us to examine our Amalek-like tendencies, the impulse to strike at the vulnerable, to justify harm in the name of our own security, to stay silent as others will do this around us. Amalek targeted the stragglers, the weak ones, the ones who could not defend themselves, the ones who were standing all the way in the back. And that's why we remember. Because I think the opposite of Amalek is not this violence to blot out or the strength to try and survive over all others, but it's to dig deeper into our morality. It's the refusal to prey on the weak even when we are wounded ourselves. It's the need to protect the vulnerable, especially when we have the power not to or the ability to turn away because it's easier. In a recent New York Times essay, or really it was an op-ed, it was beautiful, by Rabbi Shai Held, he reflects on the Torah's repeated commandment to care for the immigrant, but he widens it to taking care of those who are vulnerable. He says, the book of Exodus explicitly forbids the people from mistreating an immigrant. Contrary to popular assumptions, the prohibition on abusing the vulnerable does not derive only from the children of Israel's past experience of slavery and oppression. It is a basic demand of morality. We must not take advantage of the weak. The people's memory of having suffered in Egypt amplifies and intensifies a demand that there is already in place. Don't take advantage of the vulnerable. His framing is important. Yes, we have to remember Egypt, and yes, we have to remember Amalek. We have to remember Haman, but memory alone is not the point of all of it. Memory and the way that we choose to remember is meant to shape our moral identity. It's meant to train us away from becoming what we fear most in the world. Shabbat Zachor is not a pass for violence and hatred, which it's been used for and it will continue to be, but I pray that that's not the case. And it's not a call to blot out our enemies at any cost, or to turn away from the injustices we face day in and day out. It's a call toward the justice which is crying so deeply for us to join in on this fight. A call to be mindful not only against those who would harm us, but against the parts of ourselves that could harm others in action or in our inaction. To preserve our humanity is not just a prayer, it's a practice. It means asking again and again, who are the stragglers? Who are the ones who are exhausted? Who are the vulnerable ones? Who's at the back that needs help? And what would it mean for us to turn toward them instead of away from them? On this Shabbat Zachor, we don't simply remember what was done to us, we remember who we need to be. We are called to be a people who know what it is to be hated and who therefore refuse to let hatred swallow us from within. We pray that we preserve our humanity. It's no longer a simple prayer. May it be a call to action in a world that pushes us toward anger and hate. And may this Shabbat Zachor be not only a remembrance of Amalek, but a recommitment for each of us to help the vulnerable, to our moral compass, to return to that moral compass, and to remembering all we can and should be in the world. Shabbat Shalom.